All right, today we're going to go over the Unit 3 study guide that covers some organic molecules, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. So number 1 says a process that happens without oxygen. So any chemical reaction that happens without oxygen is an anaerobic process. Number 2 says the molecule that is the main product of cellular respiration. So remember that we do cellular respiration to extract energy from glucose, and the molecule that your cells make from that process is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, and that's the molecule that drives most of the energy needs inside of your cells. Number 3 says a green pigment found in leaves that captures energy from the sun. So remember, plants are green because they contain a pigment called chlorophyll. And there's more than one kind of chlorophyll, but you only need to know that chlorophyll is the green pigment that is found in plants. Number 4 says a process in plants that uses sunlight to make carbohydrates. So when plants use sunlight to make carbohydrates, that's called photosynthesis. So if you remember, the reactants for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. And then the products are glucose and oxygen gas. Number 5 says the breakdown of sugar when no oxygen is present is fermentation. So remember, this is the process that happens after glycolysis if oxygen is not present in large enough quantities in your cells to do cellular respiration and to go through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So fermentation is when you break down sugars with no oxygen. Number 6 says the process that releases energy by breaking down glucose and other food molecules in the presence of oxygen. So we know oxygen is present for this process. That means that it's cellular respiration. Remember that oxygen is an electron or part of the electron accepting process at the end of the electron transport chain, and that's why we make water as a waste product. Number 7 says a process that happens with oxygen. So any reaction that occurs with oxygen is aerobic, right? So oxygen has to be there in order for aerobic reactions to occur. And number 8 says an organelle found in the cells of plants and some other organisms, such as algae and some bacteria, that captures the energy from the sunlight and converts it to chemical energy. And those are chloroplasts, right? So within a plant cell, there's a bunch of structures or organelles called chloroplasts. And that is where you find chlorophyll, and that is where photosynthesis takes place in plants. Number 9 says the energy needed to get a reaction started. So that's the activation energy. You need to put a little bit of energy into chemical reactions, typically to get them going, and that, again, is called activation energy. Number 10 says a molecule needed by the body for growth and repair. It's made of many amino acids. So examples would include hair, fingernails, muscles, enzymes, things like that. And those are proteins. So remember, proteins are made of amino acids. Number 11 says a protein catalyst that speeds up the rate of specific biological reactions. So anytime you have a protein catalyst, that's called an enzyme. Remember, catalysts speed up chemical reactions. Enzymes specifically speed up biological reactions. Number 12 says the part of the cell in animals and plants where cellular respiration takes place, and that is the mitochondria. So remember, there's a structure inside of both plants and animals that does the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, and that molecule or that structure is called mitochondria. And number 13 says a compound that is the main source of energy for the body. Example, sugars. Those are carbohydrates, right? So carbohydrates are the main source of energy for the body, and glucose specifically is the carbohydrate that we call blood sugar, because that's what goes through your bloodstream and travels to your cells to provide energy. Next, we're going to go over the equations for photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So number 14 asks you to write the equation for photosynthesis. When you write the equation for photosynthesis, you should find that you have 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 water molecules plus light, and then you should have an arrow that points to the right, and that means that this equation yields, or this reaction yields, 1 glucose molecule and oxygen gas, 6 molecules of oxygen gas. When you write the equation for photosynthesis, you can write it either with chemical symbols, like it's shown here in blue, or you can write it with words, like it's shown in red. Number 15 says, what is the energy source that drives the photosynthesis reaction? And so when you look at the equation, you'll notice that on the left side of the arrow, those are the reactants, and one of those reactants is an energy source, and that energy source is light. Most of the light that plants use to drive photosynthesis comes from the sun. You can grow plants with grow lights like they do for like tomatoes and stuff in greenhouses, but most of the light comes from the sun. Now, number 16, we're going to write the equation for cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. When you write down the equation for cellular respiration, you should find that glucose plus oxygen gas yields carbon dioxide, water, and energy, and we collect that energy in the form of ATP. Next, we're going to review some chemical symbols because you'll need to know these on the test. So the chemical symbol for carbon dioxide is CO2, and the 2 is a subscript, meaning it's down below the oxygen molecule or oxygen atom. Number 18 is glucose. Glucose has the chemical formula of C6H12O6. So what that means is that there's 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. The chemical formula for water is H2O. So there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atom. And then oxygen gas is O2. So there's just 2 oxygen atoms bonded together. So those are the chemical symbols you'll need to know for the exam. The next question that we're going to go over are about some of the different reactions. So number 21 says, what are reactions that release energy called? And these reactions are called exergonic or exothermic reactions because they give off energy as they occur. Number 22 says, what are reactions that absorb energy called? And these are endothermic or endergonic reactions, and they absorb energy so that the products contain more energy than the reactants did. And then number 23 says, how do enzymes speed up chemical reactions? So enzymes are able to lower the activation energy that is needed to start a reaction, and that allows reactions to happen more quickly. Number 24 and 25 are going to have us look at some graphs that show the effect of carbon dioxide and temperature on the rate of photosynthesis. So we'll start with number 24, where you're asked to draw a graph that shows the effect of increasing carbon dioxide on the rate of photosynthesis. So you can see I've set up my graph already. I have the rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis and the carbon dioxide concentration on the x-axis. So now I'm going to show what happens as the carbon dioxide concentration increases. So you should have a graph that shows that as concentration of carbon dioxide increases, so does the rate of photosynthesis, but at some point it starts to plateau. So you're going to end up with a graph that looks something like that to show the rate of photosynthesis when it's impacted by increasing carbon dioxide. Number 25 says to draw a graph that shows the effect of increasing temperature on the rate of photosynthesis. And so photosynthesis can occur while water is a liquid, and it's generally most effective between 20 and 30 degrees. So again, I've set up my graph. I have the rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis. And you should find that you have a graph that instead of having like a plateau, it's going to go up, and then it peaks right around 25 degrees or so, and then it's going to start to go down. So your peak photosynthesis temperature is about here at about 25 degrees or so, and that is the temperature where photosynthesis happens the most efficiently. If the plant gets too hot or too cold, then photosynthesis slows down. Number 26 is going to ask you to draw one more graph that shows the effect of increasing light on the rate of photosynthesis. So one more time, I've set up my graph with the rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis and the light intensity on the x-axis. So as the intensity of light increases, the rate of photosynthesis will also increase until it reaches sort of the critical amount and it starts to plateau. So you should have a graph that looks something like that on your study guide. Number 27 says to draw a graph that shows an exothermic reaction that releases energy. So first we need to set up our graph. So here I've added my graph and I'm going to put potential energy on the y-axis and the reaction progress on the x-axis. Then I'm going to show in just a moment the reactants, the activation energy, and then how much energy is contained in the products. So remember, this is a reaction that's exothermic or exergonic, and so it releases energy. So that means that we're going to start with energy contained in the reactants. There's going to be an activation energy curve to get the reaction going, and then the products are going to contain less energy than the reactants did. So we can add some labels to this graph to make it make sense. Now that we've added labels to our graph, we can look at it even more closely. So we start with our reactants, and they have a certain amount of potential energy. In order to get them to react, we need to put energy in, and that energy is the activation energy. So that amount of energy is what it takes to get the reactants to have a reaction. Once the reaction happens, you'll notice that the products are less energetic than the reactants were. So the energy released is shown here in yellow, and that's what was given off probably as heat as the products were created. Number 28 says draw a graph that shows an endothermic reaction that absorbs energy. So we will go over the same process with a new graph. So in this graph, you can see that the reactants have less energy than the products do. So we start out with the reactants, and their potential energy is way down here. And then after activation energy has been applied at a sufficient amount, the reaction can happen. And you'll notice that some of the energy was captured in the products because the product is more energetic than the reactants. So the energy absorbed is shown here in yellow, and that's now contained in the bonds between the atoms in the products. Number 29 has a graph that shows the activation energy for an exothermic reaction without an enzyme present. So you are going to draw a line showing what happens to the activation with an enzyme present. So what you should discover or know already is that enzymes reduce the activation energy required. So if you were going to add the line for an enzyme that's catalyzed, or a reaction that's catalyzed by an enzyme, instead of having a high activation energy, if you add an enzyme, you can have a lower activation energy. And so instead of having an activation energy of this amount, now our activation energy is only this amount because that enzyme decreases the amount of energy required to get the reaction going. On this page, you're going to identify the names of the molecules pictured. So number 30 shows a molecule that has 6 carbons. We can count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And a very common 6-carbon molecule that comes in this ring shape is glucose. Number 31 shows a molecule that has this amine group with the nitrogen and 2 hydrogens, and that's a good clue that this is an amino acid. Remember, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Number 32 shows a chain of amino acids called a polypeptide that is then shaped in kind of primary, secondary, and tertiary and quaternary structures. So that's a good clue that this is a protein. Because remember, proteins are made of many amino acids and then folded into very complex shapes. And then number 33 shows a whole bunch of glucose molecules that are all bonded together in a chain. So when you have a long chain of glucose molecules, that is starch. The last page of your study guide is going to focus on enzymes. So number 34 says, what is a catalyst capable of or able to do to a chemical reaction? And you should have remembered, hopefully from your notes and other things, that catalysts or enzymes reduce activation energy. Number 35 says, what is an enzyme made of? Remember, enzymes are made of proteins. So they are organic catalysts because they're made of the organic molecule protein. Then the next section is going to have you label this image. So there's several different parts of an enzymatic reaction that are labeled with the letters A, B, C, and D, and you're just going to identify what each letter is pointing to. So number 36 says identify structure A. So structure A is just this big pink structure, and you should discover that that is an enzyme. Number 37, structure B, is pointing to this area of structure A specifically, and that is the active site. Number 38 says to identify structure C, so that's here. So structure C has been released from the enzyme, so that means that those are the products of this enzymatic reaction. And then number 39 says to identify structure D. So this is the molecule that is changed by the enzyme, which means that it is the substrate.